The summer sun had already climbed high over the Henderson ranch when Martha first saw the girl stumbling across the eastern pasture. She was young and clearly in distress, and Martha set down her basket of freshly gathered eggs and called out to her husband Thomas, who was mending fence near the barn. Thomas looked up and shielded his eyes against the bright morning light, and together they watched as the girl collapsed near the old water trough. They hurried across the dusty yard and found her lying there with her face pale and streaked with tears and her clothes torn and dirty from what must have been days of hard travel. Thomas knelt beside her while Martha brought water from the well, and the girl's eyes fluttered open with a look of fear that made Martha's heart ache. "Easy now," Thomas said in that gentle way he had with frightened animals and nervous colts. "You're safe here." The girl tried to sit up too quickly and gasped in pain, and that's when they saw her ankle was badly swollen and twisted at an unnatural angle. "Easy," Martha whispered and stroked the girl's damp hair back from her forehead. "It hurts, I know, but we'll take care of you." They got her into the house and settled on the old sofa in the front room, and Martha brought cool cloths while Thomas examined the injured ankle with careful hands that had set many a broken bone on the ranch over the years. "It's broken," he said quietly, and looked at the girl with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "From decades of squinting into the western sun, we'll need to set it proper or it won't heal right." The girl's name was Sarah, and she was 19 years old and running from a situation back east that she didn't want to talk about. And Thomas and Martha didn't press her for details. They had learned over their 35 years of marriage that some stories need time before they can be told, and some wounds need gentleness before they can heal. Thomas went to get his supplies and Martha sat with Sarah and held her hand and told her about their own daughter Claire, who had left for the city 10 years ago and rarely visited anymore. She wanted more than this dusty old ranch could give her, Martha said without bitterness. "And that's all right, because every soul has to find their own path even if it takes them away from home." Thomas came back with clean bandages and splints and a small bottle of whiskey, and he knelt beside the sofa and looked at Sarah with steady reassurance. "This is going to hurt," he said honestly, because he had never been one to sugarcoat hard truths. "But it'll be over quick, and then you can start healing proper." Sarah nodded and bit her lower lip, and Martha moved to hold her shoulders and support her, and Thomas poured a measure of whiskey and offered it to the girl. She drank it down and coughed, and Thomas waited a moment for it to take some edge off the pain before he positioned his hands carefully around her injured ankle. "Ready?" he asked, and Sarah nodded, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Easy," she moaned as he began to manipulate the broken bone back into alignment. "It hurts." Thomas froze for just a moment and met her eyes with such compassion that Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "It'll be over quick," he said softly, and then with swift, sure movements he set the bone properly and wrapped it tight with the splints and bandages, while Sarah gripped Martha's hands and tried not to cry out when it was done. They all sat in silence for a moment, catching their breath, and then Martha fetched more water and some of the soup she had made that morning, and they helped Sarah sit up enough to eat. Over the following days, a rhythm developed on the Henderson ranch that felt both new and somehow timeless. Sarah couldn't walk, so she sat in the front room or on the porch and watched as Thomas worked the cattle, and Martha tended her garden and canned vegetables and baked bread in the old wood stove. They didn't ask her to leave, and she didn't offer to go, and instead she began to help in small ways that didn't require standing. She snapped beans and shelled peas and folded laundry and polished the silver that had been Martha's grandmother's, and had traveled west in a covered wagon back in the days when the land was still wild and untamed. Thomas would come in dusty and tired at the end of each day and find the three of them sitting together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. He would lower himself into his chair with a satisfied sigh, and Martha would bring him cold lemonade, and they would talk about simple things like the weather and the cattle, and whether the henhouse needed a new roof before winter came. Sarah listened and learned and slowly began to understand that there were different kinds of wealth in this world, and that some of the richest people she had ever met lived in this modest ranch house with dust on their boots and calluses on their hands. One evening after the dishes were washed and put away, Sarah asked Martha how she and Thomas had met, and Martha smiled with a faraway look in her eyes. "At a church social in town," she said. "I was 17. and helping serve punch, and he was 22 and too shy to ask me to dance. So what happened? Sarah asked. I asked him, Martha said with a quiet laugh, and he stepped on my feet the whole time, but I didn't mind, because I could tell he was a good man, and good men are worth a few stepped-on toes. Thomas came in from checking on a mare about to foal and heard the last part and shook his head with a rueful smile. Still step on your feet sometimes, he said. That you do. Martha agreed and reached out to pat his weathered hand. But I married you anyway, and I'd do it again. The weeks passed and Sarah's ankle healed slowly but surely, and she began to put weight on it and walk with a cane that Thomas carved for her from a piece of seasoned oak. She grew stronger in other ways too, and the haunted look faded from her eyes, and she laughed more easily and began to talk about what had driven her from her home back east. It was a story Thomas and Martha had heard variations of before, because the world was often hard on young people who didn't fit into the narrow boxes that society tried to force them into. Sarah had loved the wrong person and made choices that her family couldn't forgive, and so she had left with nothing but the clothes on her back and walked for days until she collapsed on the Henderson ranch more dead than alive. Family should be a place of safety, Martha said when Sarah finished her story, and I'm sorry yours wasn't. Thomas nodded his agreement, and then stood and walked to the window and looked out at the land he had worked for 40 years. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, he said, without turning around. We've got room and we've got work if you want it, and we don't judge a person for their past when their present shows who they really are. Sarah cried then, and not from pain but from relief and gratitude, and Martha held her while Thomas stood silently by the window, giving them space for their emotions. The harvest season came and went, and Sarah proved herself a hard worker and a quick learner, and she helped Martha with the preserving and the cooking, and learned to handle the chickens and gather eggs without getting pecked. Thomas taught her to ride, and she took to it naturally, and soon she was helping move cattle from one pasture to another and checking fence lines and all the 100 small tasks that keep a ranch running. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, and Thomas would tell stories about the old days when he was young and foolish and thought he knew everything. Life has a way of teaching you humility, he would say, usually when you least expect it and most need to learn it. Winter came early that year with snow in November, and the ranch became a small island of warmth and light in a frozen landscape. They worked together to keep the animals fed and the pipes from freezing and the fire burning in the hearth. And there was something deeply satisfying about the simple rhythm of survival. One night during a particularly fierce blizzard, they sat around the fire, and Martha brought out old photo albums and showed Sarah pictures of Claire as a baby and a toddler and a young girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. And, "You miss her?" Sarah asked quietly. "Every day," Martha said. "But you can't hold on too tight to the people you love, because love isn't about possession. It's about wanting what's best for them, even when what's best takes them far away." Thomas reached over and squeezed Martha's hand, and Sarah saw the depth of connection between them and understood that real love was built slowly over years of small kindnesses and shared struggles, and choosing each other again and again. Spring came eventually, as it always does, and with it came a letter from Claire saying she was coming home for a visit and bringing someone special. She wanted them to meet. Martha was nervous and excited and cleaned the house from top to bottom and made all of Claire's favorite foods and changed the sheets in her old room 3 times because they had to be perfect. When Claire finally arrived, she brought with her a kind-faced woman named Rebecca and introduced her as her partner and waited with visible anxiety for her parents' reaction. Thomas looked at Rebecca and then at his daughter, and then he smiled that slow, warm smile of his and said, "Welcome to our home." Martha hugged them both and cried a little, and then bustled them inside where Sarah was waiting. Nervously in the kitchen, Claire stopped when she saw Sarah and looked at her parents with questions in her eyes. "This is Sarah," Martha said. "She's been staying with us and helping on the ranch, and she's become like family." The 2 young women looked at each other with recognition and understanding, and something shifted in the room like a door opening onto new possibilities. That evening they all sat around the dinner table, and the conversation flowed easily and